My name is Bill Franke, and while I'm retired from the military, I retired with a rank of Lieutenant JG, and then a few years later I got notification I'd actually made lieutenant. I'll never forget when I landed in Catlow, or it was a base close to, or it was an air base close to Catlow, and there was some guy going back to the Navy base, and I picked up a ride with him. I'll never forget going back. He had an old beat-up panel truck that belonged to the Navy. And the steering mechanism was totally screwed up. And this guy he looked like he was driving like a drunken sailor, but he was keeping it on the road. But I'll never forget that story. It was so funny because this wheel was turning rapidly back and forth, but he was maintaining the road, maintaining position in the lane. I get to Catlow. Great group of guys. Candidly, they were a little bit resentful that who the hell was this young ensign? He has very little experience, and it took some time to gain their respect and their confidence. You need to understand that when you went on these missions, that the only way that you were able to survive and return was the strength and the commitment of working together. And whereas a Lieutenant JG would come in and they'd feel no reservations whatsoever about taking them out on a mission with them, an ensign was untested. And so I always felt initially that not only was I somewhat suspect because I was a rookie and we were a brand new crew, but further because I was an ensign and hadn't yet earned my stripes, so to speak. That quickly dispelled, and things went from there. In Catlow, we were land-based, and we would go out on missions for, I don't know how long they were, typically 5 days or so. And so we live on board the boat, and we would have a sector that we would patrol, and we would patrol it 24 hours a day. And so the living conditions were those that you would get on board a boat. We used to barter with the Vietnamese, who would give us fresh fish in exchange for Coca-Colas or whatever. And so we had a lot of fresh fish, and the conditions were not comfortable. They were very hot. I can remember that I tried to sleep in the cabin of the swift boat, but we had our bunks had a foam rubber pad that was covered with naugahyde, and I would go to sleep at night, and the indentation of my cheekbone on that pad would cause the sweat to pool around my cheekbone, and I'd wake up about every half hour to 45 minutes because I started to breathe in sweat. I mean, it was just, you couldn't sleep inside. So what I ended up doing is I took a flak jacket and I put on a hatch of the engine cover, and I slept there whenever it was my turn to grab a few hours sleep. It was hot. There was not a lot of food. They were not pleasant conditions. The rivers were pretty much constant. Of course, you have fluctuations based upon tides, and at certain times of seasons, the tides would be greater than other times. But it was relatively inconsequential variance as far as the rivers and canals were concerned. But and I will tell you this, and I'm not a big John Wayne guy, and I'm not a big guy for melodrama, but going into those canals where you'd get chewed up was a very difficult thing. But I would rather go into those canals and take my chances in there than be out in the middle of the Gulf of Siam or the Pacific Ocean, going up against 35 and 40-foot seas. And I will tell you that was probably the most harrowing experiences that we ever had. Those little boats would bounce up and around and down, and you had to constantly fight them. And if you were heading into a sea, because oftentimes it would be so dark, you couldn't see a wave until it was upon you. And one of the things you always had to guard against was a 30, a gun tub on a swift boat was 17 feet off the water line. And one of the things you had to always guard against was that a wave would break just as you hit it, just as you nosed into it. That wave would break and water would cascade in that gun tub and go down, and it would be so much water that it could sink you. We lost a boat that was taking mail to a tin can off of Vietnam because of that exact same thing, and all hands were lost because the wave cascaded in, and there was so much water in there that the boat just kept going, and nobody got out. There were 7 men lost that day.